Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to the Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting. It's a special meeting today. We've got a speaker. Our speaker today, Professor Jeff Seward, has been talking to us since 2007 and has really helped us gain such knowledge of the political system and optimism and a little pessimism about who we are as American, where we are as American citizens. I thought a lot about the things that Jeff has taught me over the years. There was an assassination attempt against a candidate for the presidency yesterday, and it really made my heart heavy. The things I learned from Jeff is that, and others at these special humanist meetings that I've attended for so many years, is that America decided that we were not going to be ruled by kings anymore and queens, and which made the succession of power so different. It wasn't a birthright anymore, but we had to decide as a people and who was going to be our leader. And it's really messy. But deciding by violence is destructive and deadly. And as a humanist, I encourage you all to stay calm and not add to the animosity and anger surrounded by the 2024 election. America has survived difficult times in the past, and we will get through this difficult time as well. So I want to welcome you here this morning to our humanist meeting. And it's not only do we have Jeff speaking, which is so lovely, we have one of our scholarship winners, one of the young and bright people that we depend on so much to lead our country in the future. So anyone new to the humanist meeting, you're in for a treat because this is really going to be a good one. And I'll ask you to introduce yourself later in the meeting if you choose. Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives and use reason and empathy to guide their decisions and actions. We live ethical lives because we honor the fact that this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge all that humanists have accomplished in the arts, sciences, and humanity, but also simply for the possibility for peace and well-being when people interact with respect for one another. I'm going to ask Amanda Feller to please come forward, and she'll be introducing our scholarship winner who will be reading her essay this morning. Shelby is a graduate from Ida B. Wells. Yeah, Ida B. Wells High School, and we'll learn a little bit more about her. I'm sure Amanda will share that with us. Come on up from the front here.
I'll just make a couple of comments about the scholarship process. We'll be, as a committee, we had a wonderful committee this year, and it was a pleasure to co-chair that with Susan Pierce. And we will be asking for donations to the scholarship fund, as well as letting you in a little bit more on our process. But it was really wonderful to be part of that process and to help lead it and organize it this year. And I plan to continue that if the group will have me. And with that, I will hand it over to our essay winner.
Hi, my name is Shelby Widman. I will be a freshman at University of Washington this coming fall. I'm going to be studying microbiology and applied mathematics. Before I start, I just want to thank all of you, especially the scholarship committee, for inviting me into your group and allowing me to pursue my further education. It's really important to me, and I feel like that does really embody the mission of humanism. You know, I'm very new to it. I've just read this chapter's, ideals of humanism, but I just want to thank everyone before I start. The prompt I chose, there are two prompts, was prompt 1. 52 years ago, John Lennon's song Imagine included the concept of imagine no religion. Since then, the United States has become less religious, especially among the younger generations. Is this a good trend? Is there a religious backlash and the current threat to our democracy? So here is my essay. From the day I was born, my parents emphasized the importance and commitment to the Baptist Church. The church became my hive, my community. I could talk to any of the church elders about anything going on in my life and get an answer, one often that combined Baptist belief and common sense logic. While the space and its people felt inclusive, I watched as it gradually became exclusive to others. There were minimums set for attendance and tithe donations, and non-members were not permitted inside the building. As my parents peeled back the edges of this community and its practices, their doubts surfaced. In middle school during my 7th grade year, my parents and I left the church we'd considered our second home for a decade. In the years that followed, I continually reflected on my experiences within the church. The philosophy of purity culture rampant within the teaching of the church community unsettled me. The ideal was simple. Women were to remain pure for their future husband and avoid tempting men into sin by dressing modestly and refraining from sexual and romantic relationships before marriage. Additionally, men are to keep their minds clean, date solely for marriage, and suppress lustful ideas and feelings. Though men are often not held to the same standards as women in the eyes of the church leaders, purity culture creates trauma for all involved. These ideas and morals control the shame involved with the church at any level, forcing them to be constantly aware, even paranoid of their every move and downplay perceived misconduct to other community members. Recently, there have been an explosion of sexual abuse and assault accusations, predominantly stemming from the Southern Baptist Convention, SBC. A Houston News Corporation exposed the SBC for keeping a list of over 700 leaders within its church who have engaged in inappropriate sexual conduct with their congregation without notifying law enforcement or validating the survivors' concerns. Additionally, Lifeway Christian Resources, a Christian media company, reports that at least 10% of its church members end up leaving their congregation due to mishandled or silent sexual abuse cases. As a former congregant of the Baptist Church, these reports come to no surprise to me. I recall being taught lessons by my trusted church leaders that served to instill extremely harmful ideas about sexuality and womanhood. This innate cycle of purity culture, conditioning, abuse, and gaslighting creates generational trauma under the guise and safety of a loving community. Alongside sexual impurity, mental health is a very criticized topic within the Baptist Church. At 4 years old, I was diagnosed and treated with major depressive disorder. Despite my mental health condition stemming from my brain's biochemistry, not my sinful thoughts and behavior, I still had to conceal my diagnosis and symptoms from my church. When mental health was spoken about in the church, it was presented as a punishment for God and the only permissible treatment being prayer. These attitudes and statements further discouraged me from being honest with youth leaders about my struggles. When I finally confided in them, I was ostracized for my use of medication and therapy. Sojourners, an activism group dedicated to advancing humanitarian causes, publishes the stories of those who, like me, left oppressive organized religion. Through these stories, I found an overwhelmingly large community of people in the church who targeted due to their mental health challenges. Reverend Albert Onfrio, a pastor who experienced depression, felt that he no longer belonged in the mainstream view of Christianity. Similarly, author Monica Coleman related conversations with fellow church members who insisted Monica's mental illness was a punishment for her sins. Experiences like these only increase the feelings of ostracization and demonization of otherness in members of the Christian faith who live with mental illnesses. The Christian church weaponization of the purity culture, concealment of sexual abuse, and the shaming of members who experience mental illness are meant to control and suppress members into compliance with the individual needs of the church. Using religion as a means of control is unquestionably a threat to democracy, and yet in a recent study from the Pew Research Center, it was revealed that almost 50% of adults believe that the Christian Bible should have dominion over US laws and regulations. Ultimately, I distanced myself from my own Baptist church and community. I realized that the lessons and teaching from this community as a whole cause more harm than guidance than they provide. I see this in my own experience reflected in the exodus of young people from oppressive organized religions as a whole. Whether they're leaving to escape the harmfulness of purity culture, a legacy of sexual abuse, or the stigma around mental health, I consider this generational shift away from the Baptist church and similar systems as a powerful step toward crafting a more inclusive and thoughtful world. Thank you.
Wow. Shelby, we've got a few minutes to answer questions. Are you comfortable with that?
Of course,
Okay.
yes.
Is Joyce, go ahead and ask a question.
That the statistic you quoted was 50% of people who feel, how did you put that?
They feel that the Christian Bible should have dominion over US laws and regulations.
Was that 50% of religious people or 50% of all people polled?
All people polled.
Ooh, thank you.
Yes.
That's scary.
Yes.
Question, Albert.
Since you've left the church, can could you give us some advice when we're talking to people who are in a church trying to decide whether to stay in or get out, if we wanted to have them give fair shake to both sides of the question?
I would say it's really hard and it's a very personal decision. When I talk with my friends and former people a part of my church, it's very different from how you would talk to someone about like leaving a club or just like leaving a friend group. It is your whole community. They make it so inclusive while you're in the church. They make it your family. These are your best friends. These are your parents and family friends that you would stay the night at. You have 4th of July cookouts with them. So I think realizing that those people might be gone after you make that decision is really hard to accept as someone who is a part of that church. And because I feel like my experience was unique because my parents decided to leave and I was young enough to leave with them and I didn't really understand that. I think that made it easier for me, but it's really hard to dissect the individual views of the church while you're still in it because it's very normalized. I would suggest if you're speaking with someone in a similar situation or even, part of a group that might have those kind of toxic views, just having them take a step back, maybe having a bird's eye view of the situation, not making it personal towards them, maybe relating it to your experience, sympathy and empathy when that's appropriate to use is really helpful, but it is really specific to everyone's situation. It's very hard to kind of convince someone otherwise.
Thank you, Shelby.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jeff Seward really needs no introduction. He's been with us since 2007, and because time is short, my friend, and Uruguay is in your future, I'm just going to say, dear, dear, dear Professor Seward, take it away. Oh, come on. You're going to have a tropical drink.
I don't think this is an Uruguayan hat, but it's sort of, I was going to sing the Uruguayan national anthem today at the end of my thing, but with a company, but I can't get it on my phone or my Kindle. So, and I don't know it well enough yet to do it a cappella. This is an essential piece of equipment in Uruguay. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. It's for drinking mate. And if you walk the streets of Uruguay or Argentina, you'll see half the men carrying a thermos under their arm and a little case that has their mate bowl and their mate, and they drink it all the time. It's a tea. It's mildly addictive like coffee is and so forth. I don't care for it myself, but I really like the little bowls. So I've got my Diet Coke in here today. I am going to Uruguay soon. One of the things I have to do before I go is to sell my house. And so if anybody is interested, I have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, charming 3-level house. It's got a lot of stairs, I'm afraid. So why Uruguay? That's the title of my talk today. I turned 76 back in May. And with a couple of more birthdays, I could run for president. Way back in 2015, when I was a callow youth of only 67 years old, I gave a presentation here titled, "The Making of an Un-American, Why I Want to Move to Uruguay, but My Wife Won't Let Me." The reasons I listed at the time included the rampant racism in America, the unchecked gun violence, growing inequality, the erosion of voting rights, the growing hostility to basic science, and the fact that ridiculous Republicans like Ben Carson and Donald Trump were both leading Hillary Clinton in the polls. Little did I know that in 2015, I was living in a virtual American golden age compared to our current situation. Since 2015, we have had the chaotic Trump presidency, the January 6th insurrection, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Republican indifference to the multiple criminal and civil legal decisions against Trump, the creation of a corrupt and extremist Supreme Court majority, further attacks on voting rights, efforts by Republican governors and legislatures all over the country to attack LGBTQ rights and ban teaching about the realities of racism in US history, the rollback of programs designed to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in businesses and universities, and Supreme Court decisions that gut the power of regulatory agencies of all sorts to effectively protect the public or combat global warming. And now a decision that gives the president almost complete immunity against criminal acts committed while president. Oh, and mass shootings at a Las Vegas concert, a Buffalo supermarket, an El Paso Walmart, a Uvalde, Texas elementary school, a Parkland, Florida high school, the Pulse nightclub in Florida, a Highland Park, Illinois 4th of July parade, and a Pittsburgh synagogue, among many others, including yesterday an attempt to assassinate Donald Trump. And with all that, the serious possibility that Donald Trump will become president again, this time with a completely loyal, hand-picked team. The detailed plan laid out in Project 2025 for implementing reactionary authoritarianism in the country, and now almost complete immunity from prosecution thanks to a Supreme Court dominated by Trump appointees. All I can say is, USA, USA, we're number one, we're number one. So my evolution as an un-American has only been accentuated. It's hard to believe all that's happened just since 2015. But why Uruguay? Well, first of all, Uruguay is a lovely and comfortable place. The country is about 2/3 the physical size of Oregon and has a population of 3.25 million people, about 75% of Oregon's population. The capital city is Montevideo, which happens to be the southernmost capital city in the world. Argentina as a country is south of Uruguay, but Montevideo is actually slightly farther south than Buenos Aires is. It's about the same size as Portland, a little under 2 million people, while Portland is a little over 2 million people. As the country's capital, with over half of the nation's population, it has all the best cultural institutions of the country, the best university, the best opera company, which performs in a lovely old 19th century opera house, the best symphony, the best ballet company, the best live music and theater scene, the best and most varied collection of restaurants and bars. Montevideo is also a major port city and has a long beach along the Platte River. The beaches and the lovely tiled walkway that runs along it stretch for about 12 miles all along the edge of the city's nicest neighborhoods. If you've ever been to Rio de Janeiro, it's a little bit like Copacabana and Ipanema and Leblon, where I used to live with my wife. On the other side of the river, this is a beach that's along the river, but on the other side of the river is not the other bank, but the Atlantic Ocean. So the view from the beach is as if it's an ocean. If you go in the water is a little muddy because it's got silt from the river. Further down the coast you have just ocean beach, but it's beautiful. There are no hurricanes, no earthquakes, no tornadoes, no volcanoes in the country, and the climate is very mild. Summer high temperatures are about like in Portland, although nights are not quite so cool. And winter temperatures are about 8 to 10 degrees warmer than winter temperatures in Portland. It gets about as much annual rainfall as Portland does, but it's spread throughout the year and tends to come in big bunches from thunderstorms. So there's no long stretch of constant drizzle as there is in Portland winters. The population is very well educated and very secular. Only 37% of the population identify as religious, and many of those are barely practicing Catholics. 43% of the population say they are atheists, agnostics, or without any religion. They legally separated church and state in 1917. And there's a great story about the president who promoted the separation. His name was Jose Bachi y Ordóñez, usually referred to as simply Bachi, spelled B-A-T-L-L-E and pronounced Bachi in the Argentina-like Uruguayan accent. The Uruguayan Constitution in 1911 required the incoming president to take an oath on a Bible and included the phrase, "By our Lord God and these holy gospels." Bocci dutifully complied with the constitutional requirement by reciting that oath. And then he said, having fulfilled the constitutional requirement, which for me has no value at all, permit me to express in another form my solemn commitment that I now make. I swear by my honor as a man and a citizen that justice, progress, and the well-being of the Republic, carried out with strict obedience to the law, will inspire my greatest and permanent governing passion. Imagine the reaction in the United States were an incoming president to do that today, let alone in 1911. Bocci was essentially a rational, progressive humanist. Montevideo is also a very cosmopolitan city. Most of the population are descendants of European immigrants from Spain, Italy, and France. England was also very important in the country's 19th and early 20th century economy as well. The best private medical system, even today, is called the British Hospital. One of the best elite private schools in the city that has several presidents as prominent alumni is a French language prep school called the Lycée Français. There's a modest expat population in Montevideo. It's the most expensive city in Latin America. It's only about 55% of the cost of living of Portland, but compared to other places in Latin America, it's expensive. So there isn't a huge expat population, but there is some. Most of them of the resident foreigners are Brazilians or Argentines. I happen to speak Spanish fluently. My wife was Peruvian, as most of you know. And I really like the Uruguayans I met in my several trips there. And I already have a couple of incipient friendships there. Uruguayans are quite informal, very straightforward and natural, very calm, very sensible, very intelligent. Uruguay used to be called the Switzerland of Latin America because their banks encouraged exiles from all over South America to deposit their fortunes in secret bank accounts there. That's no longer the case. From my impression of the people, I would be more inclined to label Uruguay the Canada of South America. Small, peaceful, nice. There's also an Afro-Uruguayan population of about 8%, but slavery was never a central institution of Uruguayan society, like it was in Brazil, for example, or in the southern United States. The African influence in Uruguayan culture has left a mark in various ways, but especially in their own style of carnival, Mardi Gras. Their carnival is the longest lasting carnival of any place in the world. It goes on for 40 days in Montevideo and features marching groups of drummers and competitions among wildly costumed groups that make up satirical, often fiercely political songs, fresh for each year of carnival. The country, like Brazil and Argentina, is also crazy about soccer. The national team is always ranked in the top 10 teams in the world, often in the top 5, an impressive achievement for a country so small. Uruguay won the first 3 World Soccer Championships, 2 at the Olympics in the 1920s, and the first World Cup, which was held in Uruguay in 1930. They won the World Cup again in Brazil in 1950. The Brazilians are still crying about it. They have won the championship of the Western Hemisphere, the Copa America, a record 18 times. Their soccer teams, unfortunately, are somewhat notorious for rough physical play. Their best player for the last 15 years or so, Luis Suarez, became notorious worldwide a few years ago for biting several opposing players during games. But he's better now. And yesterday scored 2 goals in a winning game against Canada to take 3rd place in this year's Copa America. He's about to retire. Another cultural attraction for me is a wonderful private golf club right in the middle of the city, within easy walking distance of the beach and the neighborhood where I want to live. The golf course was designed in the 1920s by a famous Scottish golf architect who was also one of the principal designers of the Augusta National Course, where the Masters tournament is held every year in Georgia. I always wanted to belong to a golf club, but here in the United States, the entry fee for such a thing is about $100,000. The fee in Montevideo is only $5,000, and the climate is mild enough that you can play year-round. The club also has swimming pools, clay tennis courts, several restaurants, and social and cultural events on a regular basis. The main parts of the city are very compact. The city is very walkable. In the neighborhood where I want to live, I will be within easy walking distance of the golf club, one of the city's leading soccer clubs, the beach, and one of the city's loveliest parks and nicest art museums. I will also be within easy walking distance of a big shopping mall, which has an interesting history. During the 10-year-long military dictatorship that ended in 1985, the Punta Carretas prison was notorious for holding the regime's political prisoners, especially militants of the urban guerrilla group, the Tupamaros, and included a future president of the country, Jose Mujica, a sort of Nelson Mandela figure who spent 13 years in the prison and was world famous later as president of Uruguay, famous for his passionate warnings about climate change and passionate criticisms of modern materialism and consumerism. After the military regime fell, the new civilian governments converted the old prison into what is now the fanciest shopping center in the country. How can you not love a country that converts a political prison into a shopping mall? But of course, I'm a political scientist, and one of my principal motivations for wanting to leave the United States and become eventually a citizen of Uruguay is the social and political climate in our country and the reactionary policies that are being put in place across the country even before a possible second Trump presidency. I am fed up with the influence of Christian nationalist extremists, racists, homophobes, a corrupt Supreme Court, and neo-fascist authoritarians swarming around Donald Trump. I am confident in saying that Uruguay, over the last 30 years, 35 years now, has been the most sustainably progressive society in the world. A center-left coalition that has turned into a pluralistic but unified political party called the Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, has governed the city and province of Montevideo since 1990. And from 2004 until 2019, the Frente Amplio also elected 3 successive presidents and held an absolute majority in 3 successive national congresses. During its 3 terms in control of the national government, the Frente Amplio implemented sweeping social and economic reforms. The historical origins of Uruguay's progressive politics go back over 100 years ago to the early 1900s, and the visionary political giant I mentioned before, that rational progressive humanist named José Bachi y Ordóñez. Bachi dominated Uruguayan politics for 30 years, from about 1900 to 1930, and during his 2 terms as president, ending in 1916, 20 or even 30 years before the New Deal in the United States or the creation of the Swedish welfare state under the Swedish Social Democrats, Uruguay legalized divorce by the unilateral decision of either spouse. They did that in 1907. Legally separated church and state, abolished the death penalty and bullfighting, instituted the 8-hour day and a minimum wage, consolidated the rights of workers to organize and strike. This is 19-teens, remember. Created a system of unemployment benefits and workmen's compensation for injuries on the job. Started a system of old age pensions. Implemented the first ever, for the country, progressive tax on inheritances. Established high schools in every province of the country. Illiteracy was like 45% at the time. Created a women's university in the capital because many women from traditional families were reluctant to attend the main university where 90% of the students were men. So they created a whole separate women's university. Created public banks and public insurance companies and nationalized the railroads and other infrastructure controlled by the British. All this before 1920. In his Colorado party, Bachi also created a model of intensive grassroots participation by party members in factional clubs within each party, a model copied by other major parties ever since. Oh, and unlike the US, which was passing the Chinese Exclusion Act about this time, and neighboring Argentina, which made immigrants wait decades sometimes to become citizens, Bachi insisted on incorporating immigrants and turning them into citizens as smoothly and as rapidly as possible. And that's still true. They're very friendly to immigrants. You essentially become a permanent resident day one after you arrive. His party dominated Uruguayan politics until the 1960s. His old party then gradually became conservative, and its last president was essentially responsible for enabling the institution of a military dictatorship in the early 1970s. In reaction to that, the progressive space in Uruguayan politics was filled by a new coalition of leftist and center-left parties that created the Frente Amplio. They were persecuted by the military government, and many of their leaders ended up in exile or in prison. But after the dictatorship collapsed, they then came to power about a decade later. Here's a brief summary of the reforms that they put in place between 2004 and 2019, building on the social and economic reforms that Bachi had carried out way back in the early 1900s. First of all, they lowered inequality. It's now the lowest in Latin America. They're the most equal country in Latin America. They are more equal than the United States is, which is rare for a developing country. There's a measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's a complicated thing to calculate, but essentially, if the Gini coefficient is 0, you have complete equality. Everybody's got exactly the same. If you got a Gini coefficient of 1, one person's got everything. So Gini coefficients, the lower it is, the better. Well, Uruguay during 10 years in the early 2000s reduced their Gini coefficient from 45.9 to 39.7. At the same time, the United States was increasing its Gini coefficient from 37.5 to 41.5. And so Uruguay became more equal than the United States during that period. During a similar period, they reduced overall poverty from 40% of the population to 8% of the population in a period of about 12 years. Rural poverty was reduced from 16% to 2%. In something that's very rare in developing countries, they actually reduced the inequality between rural and urban populations. In most developing countries, that inequality grows because the cities develop and become rich much faster than the countryside did, but they managed to reduce inequality between the rural and urban populations. The minimum wage increased 370% during their governments. The last one boosted it from $300 a month to $450 a month, a 50% increase. The average salary went up 57% between 2005 and 2015. In the rest of Latin America, it only went up 20%. In Uruguay, 57%. Since 2005, how many of you in here are or were teachers? Yes, teacher pay since 2005 has gone up 82%. They created a personal income tax in 2007, reduced or eliminated regressive taxes. Labor rights. They created something called a wage council that sector by sector brings unions, employers, and representatives of the government together to set wages in the sector. The last year they did this under the Frente Amplio, all the negotiated agreements included sections protecting women against harassment and assault, protecting women against unequal wages and promotions. Membership in unions during their 3 presidential terms increased by over 300%. So it's 4 times what it was at the beginning. That also is very rare. Union membership has tended to decline in most parts of the developed world, including especially in the United States. They created a union for domestic workers, for maids and cooks and things, in 2008 to set wages and conditions. They created a union for rural workers in 2005, and that brought rural workers an 8-hour day, guaranteed overtime pay, vacation pay, Christmas bonuses, and medical coverage. One of the interesting things about the American welfare state is that from the beginning, we excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers because Southerners didn't want that, because those were largely Black workers. And those exclusions of agricultural workers and domestic workers from most of our labor legislation continues to this day. They also created a law making employers much more responsible for industrial accidents, which have been reduced by 40% as a result. Well, how did they do in terms of managing the economy during all these fairly radical reforms? They compiled one of the best economic records in the world. They had 15 consecutive years of positive economic growth, even during the years of the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. In fact, in 2008, they grew 7.2%, in 2009, 4.2%, and in 2010, 7.8%. No other country that I'm aware of managed to have positive economic growth during those 15 years. The United States didn't, none of the countries of Western Europe did, none of the other countries of Latin America did that. The Uruguayan debt is rated investment grade, and it's a smaller percentage of the gross domestic product than our American debt is. They also reduced external dependence by becoming energy independent, diversifying the economy. They built a big pulp mill that they were careful to make environmentally sound, which isn't easy with a pulp mill. They had Chinese assembly plants that came to the country to make Chinese cars in Uruguay. And they tried to develop a software and IT support industry. They reduced trade with Brazil and Argentina. This has been a problem. They have 3.5 million people. Argentina has about 50 million. Brazil has over 200 million, and they're sandwiched between these two huge countries. And so their economy has tended to be very dependent on what's going on there. But they reduced trade with Brazil and Argentina from 55% of their total trade down to only 25%. In the space of 3 presidential administrations. How about social justice rights? They legalized abortion in 2012. Only 2 other countries in Latin America now have legal abortion. They legalized same-sex civil unions in 2008. Same-sex marriage, 2013. Same-sex couples were permitted to adopt children. Gays can serve openly in the military. Transgender individuals can legally change their names and their gender identity on official ID documents. They legalized marijuana in 2017. There was already a reasonably good public health care system. They made it universal for all citizens and permanent residents. They were also first in the Americas on the Social Inclusion Index, which is an index that brings together data about women's rights, treatment of racial minorities, economic inequality, LGBTQ rights, et cetera. And they're ahead of the United States on the Social Inclusion Index. We're actually falling behind on that index. Ours is getting worse all the time. Theirs is getting better. They also did some interesting things in education. They froze spending. The big university in Uruguay is the National University in Montevideo. They froze spending on the National University in Montevideo to channel resources into regional universities in the interior. They increased students from the interior in the National University by 631%. So they basically wanted to spread access to higher education to the whole country and not have it just concentrated in Montevideo. The University of Montevideo has not been happy with this. their resources are kind of strapped as a result. They increased spending on education generally from 3% of the gross domestic product to 4.8% of the gross domestic product. They gave free laptops and free internet access to every public school student. They made preschool for 4 years old compulsory, and 95% of 3-year-olds are also in preschools. How about the environment? 90% of their electricity now comes from renewable energy sources spread across hydro, wind, solar, and biomass. They have no nuclear plants and no new hydropower units, and they're now exporting electrical energy to their neighbors instead of importing it. 55% of all their energy, including transportation fuels, is now from renewables. They reduced carbon emissions between 2009 and 2017 by 88%, and they set a goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. How about democracy? Transparency International rates Uruguay as the least corrupt country in Latin America. It's a fairly low bar, but still. And corruption seems to be pretty limited in Uruguay. And when cases erupt, the political elites and the public really jump on them right away. They're very intolerant of corruption scandals when they do occur. They also did all of this without creating a personalistic dictatorship, without in any way undermining the democratic constitution, and without creating near civil war levels of political polarization. That's a political record that can't be matched by other progressive governments in Latin America, in Cuba, Nicaragua, Chile, Venezuela, or Bolivia. The Economist, the Freedom House, and a group called VDEM rate Uruguay very high on democratic indexes. Freedom House recently rated Uruguay the 6th most democratic country in the world, the best in Latin America. Uruguay was 6th, the United States was 48th, and was rated a flawed democracy, not a full democracy. What's especially encouraging in Uruguay is what happened when the Frente Amplio finally lost the last national election in 2019 and was replaced by a coalition of conservative parties that's in power right now. What usually happens in Latin America and elsewhere after a strongly progressive government leaves power is that the progressive party or movement has become very unpopular and polarizing and quickly loses a big chunk of their political support. And their conservative successors immediately launch a major effort to reverse as many of the progressive achievements as they can get their hands on. Neither of those things happened in Uruguay. The Frente Amplio did not leave office in disgrace. They barely lost the 2019 election, and they are now favorites to return to power in this fall's national elections after just one term of their conservative opponents. And their conservative successors have not even tried to roll back any of their major progressive social reforms or their main programs for reducing inequality. There are no big culture wars in Uruguay about abortion, LGBTQ rights, or marijuana legalization. There is no politically significant reactionary Christian movement. The conservatives instead ran on reducing budget deficits, beefing up public security to reduce crime, and educational reform to address the mediocre results of the public education system. Although there has been a modest increase in economic inequality and some budget cutbacks in social programs, the conservatives haven't attacked the major economic reforms that benefited rural workers and urban domestic workers and dramatically reduced economic inequality. In fact, there was an interesting episode during the last presidential campaign. The young, dynamic conservative candidate for president in 2019, who's now president, was the son of a former conservative president. He was sort of George W. Bush to George H.W. Bush. And a minister from his father's old government reminded everyone that the father's government had abolished the old wage councils when he was president in the early 1990s and promised that they would be abolished again if the son became president. There was a big reaction to this, and the conservative son and his campaign immediately repudiated this comment and promised that the wage councils would not be touched, and they haven't been. The government has worked to try to make the wage councils, on which they have representation, a little less generous toward worker demands, but it has done nothing radical and has made no move at all to dismantle them. I'd get more of my diet mate. So basically, the conservative governments are taking the same stance toward the progressive reforms of the Frente Amplio as Republican President Dwight Eisenhower took toward the New Deal reforms in the United States. We don't especially like them, but they're now permanent parts of the political and social landscape, and it would be political suicide to try to reverse them. Here's what Eisenhower said back in 1954, just 10 years after Roosevelt's death, about the New Deal reforms. This is Eisenhower. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Project 2025 believes you can do these things. Among these this tiny group are H.L. Hunt and a few other Texas oil millionaires and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas, but their number is negligible and they are stupid. That's Eisenhower in 1954 in a letter he wrote to a friend. That is essentially the approach the current conservative government in Uruguay is taking toward the reforms of the Frente Amplio governments, which means they are becoming accepted permanent features of Uruguayan society that everyone now just takes for granted. And that means that if the Frente Amplio returns to power, as it may well do this fall, instead of having to fight those battles all over again, as we are doing now about abortion rights and diversity programs and LGBTQ rights and teaching about racism in the schools, they will be able to take those prior reforms as a permanent base that they can build on. So that's why I am moving to Uruguay and hope someday to become a citizen. I want to be part of a society that is committed to the values of equality and inclusion and democracy, a society I can be proud of instead of a society that is constantly embarrassing or horrifying me. I can't stand anymore waking up every morning to check the news to see what fresh new outrage is being inflicted on our country. I was going to conclude by singing the Uruguayan national anthem, but I can't get it up on my phone or my Kindle, and I don't have the courage to try to sing it a cappella. I haven't got it down that much. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Jeff, for today's presentation and for everything you've done for us over the years. It's been wonderful. And my understanding is that we can pay you a quick compliment through a story. We'll be doing that today. And I hope you take this as the highest compliment I can offer. Back on November 8th last year, when you were giving the first lecture on income inequality, I had told my girlfriend of 3 years that I really wanted to watch this lecture. Well, she chose a half hour before that to end our relationship. I thought to myself, should I follow her into the bedroom? Should I try and talk her out of it? And then I said, no, this relationship probably needed to end. So I stayed and watched your lecture. But I think even more importantly, her parents, who were Newsmax and Fox News watchers, got some very important information as a send-off to them. I turned the volume up extra loud so they could hear it. So thank you for everything you've done and for educating 3 Fox News and Newsmax watchers back in November.
I do what I can.
We will be having a little celebration at the end that people can share their stories. And then Joyce also has left some little postcards on your, they're out and about the chairs. And you could leave a little note of appreciation or something that you remember.
Or outrage. you know,
Yeah, or
whatever.
outrage. All right, there won't be too many of those. And there's a little tray over there that you can put your comments or cards. Okay, so let's get questioner number 2, and I think that's Joyce.
There was a period when so many South American countries were living under dictatorships. And I don't know the situations that led up to that, but are we going through some similar kinds of things now that led to those dictatorships?
Well, it would surprise me very much if the United States evolved into a military dictatorship, which is what all these were. But I think it's very possible that we could evolve in the direction of Orban's Hungary or Erdogan's Turkey, where there's just a steady drip, drip, drip of chopping away at the edges of our democracy, of especially attacking and undermining every institution that challenges the absolute power of the presidency. So attacks on the media, attacks on the courts, attacks on the administrative state. I think one of the most alarming things about, is it Project 2025?
Yes.
Yeah. Is this plan which Trump was trying to implement at the end of his first term. He was ready to go with it if he got reelected, is to take away civil service protection for about 50,000 of the top officials in the government and make them patronage jobs where he could appoint his crazy loyalists to all of those positions at the top of every agency in the government. I mean, this is just an outrageous proposal and would have profound effects, especially along with the Supreme Court decision where they reversed the Chevron decision, which told courts that they ought to defer to the rulemaking of government agencies unless they were just completely over the top. And they're now told, no, you shouldn't defer to them. So I think we're headed more in the direction of sort of a soft neo-fascism if Trump is reelected, but not an out-and-out dictatorship of the sort that occurred in Latin America. Uruguay was one of the bad ones too. They had 10 years of military dictatorship and it was pretty ugly. But nobody has nostalgia for it. Somebody told me the other day they'd visited Chile and were surprised to find a lot of Chileans, more conservative Chileans, had nostalgia. Was it you? Have nostalgia for Pinochet, and I found that too when I was in Chile. Nobody in Uruguay has nostalgia for the military regime.
Okay. Let's see. Let's get somebody from the Zoom audience. Let's see. Jules, it appears you're wanting to ask a question.
My question is the impression of their environmental astuteness is unbelievable. My question is, there is now a lot of water insecurity. Mexico City's out of water. What is the source of water at Uruguay? Where do they get their water from?
Well, they have several major rivers. This Platte River runs along their coast for, I don't know, several hundred miles. And they have there's an Uruguay River and elsewhere. So they had a considerable amount of hydropower, although they're not doing new hydropower. But as far as I know, they did have a water problem actually a few months back. They were having a drought and they had water problems in Montevideo. And they had to tap water sources that they don't usually use. And it increased the salinity of the water to a really high level to where it was barely drinkable. And this lasted for, a month or so before they got some heavy rains and the crisis passed. That's an unusual event there, but I don't know if it's something that may increase in the future. The big environmental problem they have with respect to global warming is their leading industry is cattle grazing. And cattle, as many of you know, give off an insane amount of methane. And there's not a lot you can do about that other than reducing the herds, which they aren't likely to do. So they've been sort of working hard on every other aspect of energy issues, but I don't know what they're going to do about the cattle herds.
Okay.
Good luck on your new life.
Okay, we've got question number 3 here at Friendly House.
You painted a very nice picture of Uruguay. What keeps half of Argentina from living there?
It's expensive for them. The cost of living in Montevideo is twice what it is in Buenos Aires. Uruguay gets a ton of Argentine tourists, but that's actually been somewhat impacted by the problems in the Argentine economy. The cost of living in Buenos Aires is about 25 or 30% of what it is in Portland. It's almost double that in Montevideo. The bigger question is what keeps Uruguayans from moving to Buenos Aires? And the answer is Argentina's a mess in politically and economically. Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable with all the turbulence and instability and erosion of democracy and things that have happened in Brazil and Argentina, how well the Uruguayans have managed to insulate themselves from all of that, and except for the 10 years of military dictatorship, had a very vibrant democracy all through the 20th and now 21st century.
Questioner number 4.
Ask, what is the main source of wealth in Uruguay, and where they do get money from for investing in education and inequality and all this, GDP? Do they have natural resources or only?
Cattle ranching is the main source of wealth. So cattle. So they export a lot of beef and grains. Their economy in some ways, their rural economy is a lot like Argentina. They export the same kinds of things, but they've been doing better. The Chinese for a while were actually importing live cattle from Uruguay to start cattle herds in China, because as China got richer and they reduced their poverty a lot, Chinese people wanted more meat. And instead of importing it, they said, well, let's import the cows instead and start our own cattle industry. They tried to diversify more and more, and they've been somewhat successful in that. But it's hard for a small country. But like I say, they had 15 years of positive growth, and no other country in the world, developed country, was having that at the time. It was very impressive. They were not irresponsible populist economic managers, as many progressive governments tend to end up being. They've done very well, and the conservative governments have managed the economy reasonably well during their 5 years as well. So if the Frente Amplio comes back to power, they aren't going to inherit catastrophic conditions. The way every government in Argentina, whether it's the Peronist left or the conservative right, every government in Argentina inherits an economic catastrophe that they usually make worse.
We have questioner number 5. Who's number 5?
You about the influence of lobbyists on the government. And the reason why I'd like to know this is I recently read an article in Atlantic that the title was something like "The Aspect of Our Country That Ate Our Government." And it gave kind of a brief history of lobbyists in this our country, starting in the 1970s, as a way to push back against advances in human rights. Right. And the lobbyists have become so successful in carrying out what corporations want, that now corporations have their own lobby companies.
The power of lobbyists tends to be inversely proportional to the strength of political parties. Where political parties are weak and each elected politician is sort of a power unto him or herself, then lobbyists have a field day, 'cause they can go deal with individual senators or congressmen and try to get them through whatever means, campaign contributions or out and out bribery like Senator Menendez. But if you have a strong party, the individual members of the legislature don't have the power to vote against their party. You know, the parties tend to vote as a bloc. So if you're going to exert political influence, you've got to do it on the leadership of the political parties in a pretty public way. And so conservative economic interests have influence in Uruguay, especially in the conservative parties, but it's fairly out in the open. You don't have this phenomenon of lobbyists sitting in congressional committees and writing the legislation the way you do here, or invading the public administration and capturing regulatory agencies for themselves. It just doesn't work that way as much. And you have the same thing in, say, in Britain, political parties are strong. So there's no point in going and lobbying an individual member of parliament. You've got to lobby the leadership of the Tory party or the leadership of the Labour Party to accomplish stuff. We have extremely weak political parties, and so it's much easier to go and lobby individual members of legislatures or of the National Congress.
Very good. We have speaker number 6, or not speaker, questioner number 6, sorry.
You did answer my question, so I'll make it short. Uruguay has no oil, or how else has it resisted the taint of US capitalism?
They actually, I don't know what's happening with currently, but a few years ago, like 4 years ago or something, they discovered some big oil reserves that they want to exploit. But I don't know that they've done much with them yet. But previously they hadn't had any oil. And I don't know if they must import a lot of, I don't know if they import a lot of oil or just import products like gasoline and things. But you know, they have a lot of biomass. I don't know if they are using alcohol in their fuels the way Brazil does, but it wouldn't surprise me. I would assume, given their record, and the conservative parties are not climate change deniers, right? And so I would guess that Uruguay will fairly rapidly embrace electric vehicles.
Questioner number 7.
Uruguay sounds fabulous, but for the unilingual among us, do you have any English-speaking countries that would sort of be a potential second choice? New Zealand.
New Zealand. New Zealand's pretty good. They had a very good center-left prime minister, the woman who stepped down a year or two ago. Their conservatives are pretty snotty, but they aren't crazy. And it's a beautiful country, and they speak a strangely accented English. My daughter went to a Waldorf school, and they had a teacher who was from New Zealand. And he assigned his class one day, they do a lot of artwork in Waldorf schools, to draw a picture of a bear in the woods. But in the New Zealand accent, bear is pronounced beer.
Oh.
And so half the class drew little bottles of beer in the forest. But yeah, I kind of recommend New Zealand.
Canada?
And well, Canada's so damn cold, you know, but it's getting warmer all the time, you know. I really like Canadian cities, but the weather is really fierce. Victoria and Vancouver have milder climates. They're like Portland and Seattle, only 5 degrees colder. In Vancouver is just absurd now. Montreal is a really interesting city. Quebec is very nice. Toronto is a terrific city, but cold, my goodness.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. You were number 7. Okay, questioner 8. Stay.
You mentioned mass shootings in the U.S. as one of the things that bothers you about the U.S. and it bothers me a lot. I call it the gun culture. So I'm wondering, are there any shootings in Uruguay, and what about the government regulations? Is there anything like the Second Amendment that guarantees ownership?
There's nothing like the Second Amendment, but they haven't banned guns either, like Britain or Australia and so forth. I'm not aware of any mass shootings in the time that I've been studying it. They had a civil war at the beginning of the 20th century, in like 1900, where they killed a lot of each other. They have a fairly high murder rate in the poorer sections of Montevideo that is often drug or gang related. And like most countries, they have a problem with and are running campaigns against domestic killing of women, but it's not more pronounced than elsewhere. And there's a lot of publicity about it, a lot of attempts to try and figure out how to reduce that. But the murder rate is fairly high. It's about like Portland.
Jeff, what's the average age of Uruguay? I mean, we're beginning to, our country's aging. How about them?
You know, I'm not sure. I think their population is younger than we are, but it's aging also because they are getting some exodus of younger people who are graduating from the university and don't have a lot of interesting career opportunities. So they're, moving to Spain or to the US and so forth. So it's one reason they're very encouraging of immigration.
Okay. There may be, Sue Pierce, do you have a question you would like to ask?
Okay, no, not so much question. I just was going to type a thank you to Jeff for everything, and best of luck. Hasta luego, and Jeff will understand. Go Maniacs!
Thank you very much.
Okay.
One thing I've told Joyce and other people is I'd be happy to do a Zoom lecture after the elections from Uruguay.
Yeah.
Do my usual election post-mortem like I've been doing here for years.
We'll put you down on the calendar. You'll have to talk to Joyce before you leave and we'll get a date. We have question number 8.
Yeah, Jeff, your reasoning is great and I really support your decision, but my question is why golf?
Well, it's one of my more retrograde habits. I mean, it's an environmental disaster, golf is. But one of the early things that turned me against the progressive government of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela was he wanted to eliminate all the golf courses. I thought, no, not that. I've been golfing since I was 10. It's my favorite form of physical recreation. I walk the course. I don't ride in the little buggies. And this golf course that they have that will be within walking distance is just gorgeous. It's sort of traditional. They haven't modernized it, so it's a lot like the courses I grew up playing. And I just love golf. Once upon a time, I was a pretty good golfer. I had an 8 handicap once long ago. These days, it would be more like 18.
I'm thinking it even money that in 1 year we'll all be wishing we got with you.
Yeah.
Which do you take which side of that bet would you take?
I can't read all of your minds,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, I think things are liable to get worse here before they get better. I don't know how this assassination attempt is going to play, whether it's going to generate a wave of sympathy for Trump that will make his election more secure. I personally want Biden to step aside and let Kamala Harris be the candidate, and I think Kamala Harris would slice him up.
Right.
Her relatively low approval ratings right now, I think, are a reflection of Biden. And I think if she became the candidate, there'd be so many people that say, finally, I don't have to choose between these 2 old geezers. Here's a reasonably fresh new face who's articulate and strong and exciting. I think people would be excited to have some other choice. And the Trump voters aren't going to vote for any Democrat, but I think she might become very popular among independents. And so that would be my hope. But even if Kamala Harris, if the Democrats manage to hang on to the presidency, the Congress is still at best going to be very closely divided between Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats may lose one or both houses. And so, you know, there's going to be more craziness coming out of the Republican caucuses in the Congress and political paralysis. And so I don't see, and state legislatures and state governors in Republican states continuing to do just more and more outrageous things. You know, I really think they're coming after contraception soon. In some ways, they already are. And I mean, these campaigns that say, oh, you can't teach anything about race in the school that would make students feel uncomfortable. Well, then you can't teach anything about race in the schools, because teaching about the history of racism in the United States ought to make every student uncomfortable. And if you're not making students feel uncomfortable about race in the United States, then you aren't really teaching about race.
Right.
And that's the kind of legislation that's being passed. And so I would just, you know, I don't know how you be a social studies teacher in Alabama or Texas or Mississippi. You have to basically lie to your classes or face a mob at your doorstep.
Jeff, there's cities in New York State, in Western New York State, where social studies teachers can't teach. I mean, legally they can, but I have a nephew that he cannot teach in a strong Republican district now. I mean, social studies accurate. So, I mean, so it's our whole country. Let's see, there's a note from, I think it's from Marcia Abelman. She said, sorry, I must leave, but please convey to Jeff that I have gotten so much valuable information from him. Many thanks and good wishes to you, and we wish we could go with you. Okay. Any other questions? Now, okay, go ahead.
Ethanol and biomass are a problem. And I'm hoping that, and we're getting away from it, hopefully in this country. And I figure in Uruguay, it might be biomass from grain and whatever, and that might not be so detrimental. Do you know?
I'm not sure. I don't know what they're doing with respect to gasoline. I was just sort of speculating that they're doing biomass. I know they're doing some biomass for energy, but I don't know if it's specifically for transportation fuels. But given the general orientation of the place, I think they'll move to electric vehicles fast. Their agriculture is pretty organic. They never went in big for herbicides and pesticides. They haven't had to undo, and they don't use steroids and things in their cattle. And so their meat and their produce are pretty clean, you know, without having had to have a ecological revolution, because they never went down that road in a big way in the first place. It's a very intelligent country. I've just been reading a biography of this Bachi from the early 20th century, and he was really an extraordinary character, especially these anti-Catholic measures that he kept pushing. And they were very popular in his party. I was just reading, there was a candidate, they were trying to elect candidates for the Senate. There were 6 Senate seats open. And he was sort of guiding the selection of his party's candidates. And this one candidate was having a really hard time convincing the base of the party that he should be the candidate, because they were discriminating against him because he was Catholic. And somebody gave a speech and said, well, you know, we haven't yet made liberal anti-religious positions the requirement for our candidates. And so since we haven't done that yet, we should tolerate him running even though he is a Catholic. So this wasn't Bocci himself. This was sort of the sentiments of the party. The young members of the party especially were sort of militantly anti-clerical.
Wow.
And not just anti-clerical. It wasn't just that they were opposed to the power of the church. I mean, that was general through Latin America. There was struggles over trying to get the economic and social power of the church tamped down. They were anti-religious. I mean, they were against revealed religion. They were against Catholicism and Christianity in general, not just undue power by the church.
Paul, you have a question.
Steve, I think partly misspoke on the teaching the race in schools because it makes students uncomfortable. It doesn't, they're allowed to make students of color uncomfortable.
That's right. That's right.
We tend to say students and we think white.
That's a good point, Paul.
They are permitted to make Black students uncomfortable.
And we're going to close with a question from the fellers. Can we get it?
Okay. Actually, I have kind of a tag team question here. I would like to know from Shelby if she feels more optimistic or how you feel about what Jeff is.
So I think I myself in high school was part of Leicester Student Union. I founded that and with one of my close friends. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but so I think, you know, politics, just how America is, has been very relevant in my life. You know, this will be the first election that I'll be able to vote in. So I think almost seeing that kind of evolution over time. You know, I've lived through Trump's presidency. I've lived through Biden's presidency, Obama. And I think just seeing like the evolution, kind of like the downfall almost of America. Like I tell my parents, like, I think a civil war is coming. I think, you know, this is it. And I try to be a little bit more optimistic. You know, I appreciate you ensuring everyone to stay calm and stuff like that. I think for me, the numbers really make sense to me. I'm definitely a numbers oriented person. And I think you sharing all the things that Uruguay has done to become more sustainable, both politically, economically, and socially, has made me feel better. Maybe that could be used as a model in the future. But, you know, I try to be optimistic, but it's definitely hard.
The example of Uruguay at least gives you the sense that, oh, well, this isn't completely impossible. Here's a country that has done all these things and continues to do them. But it's a little hard for me to see how America is going to evolve to that. I worry that with this assassination attempt yesterday, that it's going to spark a little wave of retaliatory political violence by the right against liberal candidates or something. Apparently this guy who they shot and killed, who did the shooting, had been a registered Republican. But he had moved towards the Democrats. It sounds like he was an anti-Trump Republican.
Oh.
But you know, I worry that suddenly there'll be assassination attempts against Biden or Harris or Senate candidates or other kinds of. I have a historian colleague from Pacific, a friend of mine, who believes that we're headed for civil war. He says it's going to be bad because the conservatives have all the guns. He says, you know, liberals and progressives should start buying guns. He hasn't himself, but
yeah. You know, but when I was an early voter, about the same age as you, the first vote, and many people in this room that we voted for was the Nixon McGovern, and it was rough back then. There were real assassination. I mean, people were dying in assassination. People were fighting, and we got through that. And let's hope we get through this. That's all I can say. Folks, we're going to close with some announcements.